The frost came early that year, and it came for everyone, but it seemed to Eleanor Blythe that it came hardest for her family. She woke before the sun, as she always did, and dressed in the dark so as not to spend a candle on herself. Her fingers found the buttons of her dress by memory alone, and by the time she reached the kitchen, her hands were already stiff with cold, the kind of cold that lived in the walls of a house that could no longer afford enough coal. There is a particular ache that comes from being poor and proud at once, and Eleanor carried it the way other girls carried ribbons, quietly and without complaint, because complaint changed nothing and only cost more than it earned. She packed the jars herself, small clay pots of preserves, their lids tied down with cloth and string, made from whatever fruit the last of her father's small orchard still gave up each year. It was not much of an orchard now. Half the trees had been sold with the rest of the land 2 winters past, when her father's debts had finally caught up to a man who had spent his life extending credit to others and forgetting to collect his own. He had died that spring, quietly, without fuss, the way he had lived, and left behind a wife too frail to work and a boy too young to, and a daughter who discovered in the weeks that followed that grief was a luxury she did not have time to fully spend. So Eleanor sold jam. 3 mornings a week, she walked the 2 miles into the county market with a basket on her arm heavy enough to ache by the 2nd mile. And she set up her small table near the edge of the square, where the stalls were cheapest and the wind was worst. She had a gift, though no one had ever thought to name it or nurture it. She could add a column of figures faster in her head than the wool merchants could on their fingers, could tell at a glance whether a customer's coin was short, could keep a full day's accounting in her memory without ever writing a number down. It was a small, private competence, invisible to everyone but herself, and it was, in those days, the only thing that still belonged entirely to her. Her bonnet had been mended so many times that the ribbon no longer matched the cloth, a faded blue against a fabric gone the color of weak tea. She did not mind it, or told herself she did not. What she minded was the cold in her mother's chest that would not fully leave now even in the warmer months, and the way her brother Thomas, only 11, had begun asking when he might leave his lessons and find work instead, as though a boy his age owed the world an income. She minded those things. She did not mind a ribbon. On the highest shelf in their kitchen, above the hearth, sat a single jar of damson preserves, dark, rich, the last her mother had made with her own hands before her illness settled in for good. It had been meant for a celebration. Eleanor could no longer remember what celebration. Perhaps her father's recovery from debt that never came. Perhaps Thomas's naming day. Perhaps nothing at all. Just a mother's private hope that somewhere ahead of them there would be a day worth opening a jar for. It sat there now collecting dust, untouched, because no such day had yet arrived, and because to open it without cause felt, to Eleanor, like giving up on the day ever coming. Eleanor's mother had once been a woman who filled a kitchen with noise, humming while she stirred, calling out sums for Eleanor to check, laughing easily at small things. That woman had begun to fade the winter her husband died, not all at once, but slowly, the way a fire goes out when no one remembers to feed it. Now she spent most days in a chair near the small window, a shawl over her knees even in the milder hours, watching the road as though she expected someone to come walking up it who never did. Eleanor had learned to read her mother's coughing the way she read a column of figures, which fits meant only the cold, and which meant something that would need broth and rest and worry for a week after. She never let her mother see the worry on her face. She had decided early on that her mother had earned the right to rest without watching her daughter carry the weight of it. Thomas, for his part, had inherited none of his sister's stillness. He was a restless boy, quick with his hands and quicker with questions, and he hated, more than anything, being told he was too young for the things that mattered. He had asked Eleanor twice that autumn whether he might leave his letters and find work at the smithy instead, and twice she had told him no, more sharply than she meant to, because the thought of Thomas trading his childhood for coin, the way she had already traded most of hers, felt, to her, like the one loss she could not bear to allow. She wanted, more than she wanted warmth or food or rest, for at least one of them to come out the other side of this thin, cold season with something left untouched. The market, on the morning she walked to it, was its own small kingdom of struggle and pride. Every stall belonged to someone who had woken earlier than they wished, in a house colder than they wished, to sell something for less than it was worth to people who would haggle anyway. Eleanor had learned the rhythms of it the way she learned everything, quickly, and without anyone teaching her. She knew which merchants would try to shortchange a distracted customer, and which ones never would. She knew the exact weight a jar needed to feel in a stranger's hand to seem generous without costing her family too dearly. She knew, most of all, that no one at that market looked twice at a girl in a mended bonnet, and she had decided somewhere in the last 2 years that being unseen was not the same as being unworthy, even on the mornings when it felt very much the same. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, cold enough that her breath hung in front of her like a small ghost, that a tall man in a plain gray coat came through the market with no regard for the order of things. He walked as though the crowd ought to part for him, which, though Eleanor did not yet know it, it usually did, and when he reached her stall, he did not go around it. He simply expected her to move. "You're in my way," he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, the flat tone of a man unused to being told anything in return. Eleanor did not curtsy. She did not lower her eyes the way a girl of her station had been raised to. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at a column of poorly added figures, and said, evenly, "Then you'll have to wait your turn, sir, same as everyone else." For a moment he only stared at her, as if she had spoken in a language he had once known and long since forgotten. Then, to her surprise, something in his face loosened, not quite a smile, but the shadow of where one might have been, years ago, before whatever had hardened him into the man now standing in her wind-worn market stall. He did not apologize. He simply stepped aside and waited, and when the woman ahead of him finished her business, he bought a single jar of gooseberry preserve without haggling over the price, which no one at that market ever did, and walked away without giving his name. Eleanor thought nothing more of it. She could not have known that the man in the plain gray coat was Julian Ashworth, Duke of Marchmont, who dressed like a stranger and walked through the market unrecognized precisely so that, for 1 hour a week, no one would bow to him, defer to him, or flatter him. Because flattery, he had come to believe, told a man nothing true about himself, and Julian had grown desperate, in the 3 years since his father's death, to hear something true. His father's death sat in him still, unhealed, the way a wound sometimes does when a man refuses to let it close properly. In the old Duke's final year, father and son had quarreled over the estate, over a woman Julian had once loved and lost to his father's disapproval, over 100 small things that had, in hindsight, meant nothing at all. And Julian had been cold to him in those last months in a way he now could not undo. His father had gone before the year was out, quietly, the way these things sometimes happen, without any last conversation to smooth the space between them, and Julian had spent every day since convinced, in some private and unspoken part of himself, that his own coldness had hastened his father's decline. He had never said this aloud to anyone. He had simply become a colder man himself, as if punishing his own heart for the crime of having once had one, and his household had learned to move around him carefully, and his ballroom, grand as it was, had not held a real laugh in 3 years. The quarrel itself had been small, the way most quarrels that leave permanent marks tend to be. Julian had wanted that final year to marry a gentleman's daughter from a neighboring county, a woman of modest fortune but genuine warmth, whom he had loved in the plain, unremarkable way young men sometimes love before life teaches them to guard themselves against it. His father, old and proud and increasingly fearful of the estate's future in uncertain hands, had refused the match, calling it beneath the family's standing, and Julian, stung more by the dismissal of his own judgment than by the loss of the match itself, had said things in anger he had never found a way to take back. He had told his father, in their last real conversation, that he hoped he would never have to seek the old man's approval for anything again. 3 months later, his father was gone, and the hope had come true in the cruelest possible way, leaving Julian with nothing to do with the words but carry them. He had not married the gentleman's daughter either, in the end. She had, quite sensibly, tired of waiting for a man too consumed by grief and self-blame to properly court her, and had married elsewhere within the year. Julian had told himself he did not mind. He had told himself a great many things in those 3 years that were not entirely true, and had built, brick by careful brick, a version of himself so guarded that even his own household staff had come to speak of him more as a set of expectations to be met than as a man to be known. It was this version of Julian who had first walked, unrecognized, into the county market, hoping for nothing more than an hour each week of not being managed, and who had found instead, in a girl with chapped hands and an unbending spine, the first honest conversation he had had in 3 years. Eleanor's refusal to flatter him, the plainness of her voice, the fact that she had looked at him as though he were simply a man taking up space rather than a title to be managed, lodged itself in him like a splinter he could not stop touching. He told himself he would not return to that stall. He returned the following week regardless, in the same plain coat, and told himself it was only for the gooseberry preserve, which was, in fact, very good. The weeks that followed built themselves quietly, the way certain seasons do, without any single dramatic turn to mark their passing. Julian found reasons to walk that stretch of the market more often than a duke had any true business doing. He watched, without ever admitting to himself that he was watching, how Eleanor managed her table, how she never shorted a customer and never let one short her, how she wrapped an extra spoonful of jam into a poor child's jar without charging for it and pretended, when the mother tried to pay, that she had simply miscounted. He watched her count coins under her breath with a speed that startled him, and once, when a merchant 2 stalls down tried to shortchange an elderly woman, watched Eleanor step in with nothing but arithmetic and a level voice and correct the sum before the old woman even understood she'd nearly been cheated. He did not know in those weeks what he was doing. He told himself it was curiosity. In truth, it was something closer to hunger. The particular hunger of a man who has been surrounded all his life by people telling him what he wished to hear, finally standing near someone who told him only what was true. There was a rhythm to his visits that he never planned and never admitted to planning. He would leave the great house on foot, alone, telling his steward only that he wished to walk, and he would arrive at the market with no particular errand in mind beyond the one he refused to name, even to himself. He learned the market's whole small ecosystem, the way a man learns a language he did not expect to need. The baker who always sold out of the good loaves before mid-morning. The old soldier who sold ribbons and told anyone who would listen about a battle he had survived and would not describe in detail. The boy who swept the square for coppers and dreamed, loudly and often, of one day owning a shop of his own. Julian had lived his whole life above this world, in the sense that a man lives above a river he only ever sees from a bridge, and he found himself, that autumn, strangely grateful to be standing finally in the water of it. He watched Eleanor most of all, though he told himself this was simple attentiveness and nothing more. He watched her give a farmer's wife the correct change without once glancing down to count it, her eyes instead on the woman's tired face, offering some small kindness in conversation as her hands worked. He watched her scold a boy gently for trying to slip a jar under his coat, and then, once the boy had gone red with shame, watched her quietly press a smaller jar into his hands anyway, and tell him to come back and pay her when he could, because a hungry boy was not the same thing as a thief. He began to understand that her honesty was not a hardness in her, as he had first assumed, but a kind of care wearing a plain face. She counted every coin correctly because every coin mattered to someone, and she would not be the reason it went missing. It was this, more than anything, that began to trouble him about his own house. If a market girl selling jam out of a basket could keep such careful, honest account of coppers and half-pennies, he found himself wondering late at night why he had never once doubted the far larger sums his own estate managed, simply because the man managing them wore a good coat and called him cousin. What Eleanor did not know, what she would not learn for a long while yet, was that her small, ordinary struggle to keep her family fed was tangled, without her ever suspecting it, in something far larger than a market stall. The Duke's estate manager, a distant cousin named Harold Ashworth, stood to inherit Marchmont entirely should Julian die without an heir, and Harold had spent the better part of 3 years quietly bending the estate's ledgers to his own advantage. Tenant rents diverted a little at a time into accounts that were not his to fill, debts invented against tenants who had none, records altered so carefully that no single page ever looked wrong on its own. And the market square where Eleanor sold her jam, the very ground beneath her chapped and freezing feet, sat on land that Harold had, through a falsified debt bearing her late father's signature, been quietly maneuvering to seize. Harold's cruelty was never loud. It never announced itself with a raised hand or a raised voice. It moved instead through smaller things, a rumor let loose about a young woman's virtue, timed carefully so it would ruin her name before any magistrate could hear her case. A debt collector sent to a sick woman's door in the coldest week of the year, though the debt itself did not exist. He did not do these things out of any relish for the suffering of others. He did them out of a fear so old it had calcified into something almost indistinguishable from cruelty, the fear of a boy who had grown up the poor branch of a rich family, who had spent his whole life watching doors close in front of him simply for the accident of his birth order, and who had promised himself somewhere along the way that he would never again stand on the wrong side of a closing door. That fear was real. It did not make what he did forgivable, but it was, in the end, the very same fear, once exposed to the light, that would allow him to be stopped without being destroyed entirely. Eleanor knew none of this yet. She knew only that a strange, quiet man in a plain coat kept returning to buy jam he did not need, and that she found herself, against her own better judgment, looking for him among the crowd on the mornings she came to market. Their second real conversation came on a morning when the wind was sharp enough to sting, and Eleanor's hands had gone raw with the cold of counting coins without gloves. The man in the gray coat, she still did not know his name, set down more money than the jar was worth and did not wait for the difference. "You've overpaid," she said, holding the excess out to him. "Have I?" he said. It was not really a question. "You have. I may sell preserves out of a basket, sir, but I can still count." Something shifted in his face again, that same shadow of an old smile. "I don't doubt it," he said. "You corrected that merchant's sums for that woman last week without so much as raising your voice. I imagine you could count the stars if someone asked you to." Eleanor felt heat rise in her face despite the cold, unused to being noticed, let alone remembered. "You were watching," she said. "I was standing in a market," he said. "It is difficult not to see what happens in front of one's own eyes. Most people manage it easily enough." "Then most people," he said, "are not paying attention." She did not know what to make of him. He spoke like an educated man, dressed like a plain one, and carried himself like neither, like someone unused to being questioned who was, for reasons she could not guess, choosing to let himself be questioned anyway. She pressed the extra coin back into his hand and told him plainly that she did not take charity, only fair payment, and he took the coin back without protest, though something in his expression suggested he had not expected to be refused and had not entirely disliked it either. He came back the next week, and the week after. He never gave his name, and she, out of a stubborn pride she could not have explained even to herself, never asked for it. Their conversations in those early weeks rarely lasted more than a few minutes, and rarely touched on anything beyond the market itself, the quality of that season's fruit, the fairness of a particular merchant's prices, whether the coming winter would be as hard as the last. And yet Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she looked forward to those few minutes more than she looked forward to anything else in her week. He asked her questions no one else bothered to ask a girl behind a market stall. Not about her family's circumstances, which everyone in town already gossiped about freely enough, but about her, about what she thought, about whether she had ever wanted anything for herself beyond keeping her family fed. No one had asked her that in years. She was not entirely sure, the first time he asked it, that she had an honest answer. "I suppose I would like," she told him once, surprising herself with the admission, "to see my brother grow up without ever once being told he is too poor to want something. That is not really wanting something for myself, I know." "It is, rather," Julian said. "Wanting safety for the people you love is still a wanting. Most people never manage even that much honestly. They pretend they want nothing at all and call it virtue." She had looked at him a long moment after that, unsettled by how closely the words had landed, and had changed the subject to the price of sugar, because it seemed, in that moment, the safer thing to discuss. He, in turn, told her almost nothing true about himself, though not, she would later understand, out of any wish to deceive her, only because he had grown so unused to being asked ordinary questions that he no longer knew, at first, how to answer them plainly, When she asked what he did with his days, he told her only that he managed land, which was true in the barest sense and false in every sense that mattered. When she asked whether he had family, he told her he had none left worth the mentioning, which she took, at the time, for simple loneliness, and which was, in fact, closer to grief than she understood. What Eleanor did not see, what only the reader is permitted to see, in the quiet architecture of those weeks, was the growing distance between the man she believed him to be and the man he actually was. While she counted coins in the cold, Julian returned each evening to a great house full of servants who bowed too low and spoke too carefully, to ledgers he trusted less each month without knowing precisely why, to a portrait of his father in the long gallery that he could not walk past without slowing his step, as though some part of him still hoped the old man might impossibly speak. He began, in those weeks, to watch Harold more closely too. Not out of suspicion at first, only out of the general restlessness of a man newly reminded, by an honest girl in a market square, that most people around him were not being honest with him at all. He asked once for the tenant rolls to be brought to his study instead of simply approved on Harold's word, as had become their habit. Harold delivered them promptly, smoothly, with an explanation ready for every irregularity Julian's eye happened to catch. Explanations that sounded reasonable enough, on their own, that Julian let the matter rest. He did not yet know to look harder. He only knew in some unnamed way that he had begun looking at all, and that the looking had started the same week he'd first been told, plainly, to wait his turn. The vigilance deepened without either of them naming it as such. Eleanor, for her part, had begun to notice things too. The fine wool beneath the plain coat when the wind lifted it, the way the man's boots, though scuffed on purpose, were cut from leather no market-goer could afford, the careful, watchful stillness of him, like someone accustomed to being observed and only now learning what it felt like to observe instead. She told herself it did not matter who he was. She had a mother to nurse and a brother to feed and no room in her days for the mystery of a well-dressed stranger's boots. But she found herself, some mornings, arranging her jars a little more carefully before he arrived. She told herself this, too, did not matter. Julian, meanwhile, began quietly gathering what he could not yet name as evidence. Not because he suspected Harold of anything specific, but because the habit of honest attention once started does not easily stop itself. He compared one season's rent rolls against another, late at night, alone, by candlelight. The way a man does work he is not yet ready to admit he is doing. He found small discrepancies. A tenant recorded as behind on payment, who had in fact paid in full. A debt entered against a name he did not recognize, Blythe, attached to a small parcel of land at the edge of the county market. A debt with no corresponding record of the loan that had supposedly created it. He did not yet connect the name to the woman selling jam. Not fully, not consciously. But something in him had begun, quietly, to prepare. The near loss, when it came publicly, and it came fast, the way disasters built slowly beneath the surface always seem to when they finally break through. It happened at the county assembly, the one grand social gathering of the season that drew the whole district together beneath candlelight and good manners. Merchants and gentry mixed for one evening under the fiction that rank did not matter quite so much on a dance floor as it did everywhere else. Eleanor had not been meant to attend at all. Girls who sold jam in the cold did not receive invitations to assemblies. But her aunt, a woman of modest standing who had married slightly above herself, had insisted Eleanor come as her companion for the evening, if only to give the poor girl one evening that was not spent counting coins. Eleanor wore a dress that had been let out and taken in so many times it no longer quite remembered its original shape, and she stood near the edge of the room, out of habit, the way she stood at the edge of the market. She did not expect to be noticed. She did not expect, certainly, to see the man in the plain gray coat standing across the room in a dark blue coat, far finer than anything she had ever seen him wear, being addressed by every person who approached him as Your Grace. She understood in that moment, with a cold that had nothing to do with the season, exactly who he was. And she understood, a heartbeat later, exactly how foolish she must have seemed to him these past weeks, a jam seller amusing a duke on his afternoon off, like a curiosity he had collected for sport. She did not have time to sit with that thought before the second blow arrived. It began as a murmur near the refreshment table and spread the way fire spreads through dry grass. A rumor, carefully placed and carefully timed, that the Blythe girl who sold preserves at market had been caught stealing from her own customers, that her family's debts were far larger than anyone had known, that her father had died not an honest man ruined by circumstance, but a dishonest one, hiding debts under false names to protect what little he had left. Harold Ashworth, standing near the edge of the crowd with a glass of wine he barely touched, watched the rumor take hold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally closed a door he has spent years trying to shut. By the time the room's attention turned fully toward her, Eleanor stood alone in the middle of it, her aunt too shocked to speak in her defense, her mother home in bed too ill to have come at all, her young brother nowhere near to comfort her. A local magistrate, present at the assembly and eager to be seen doing his duty before so fine a crowd, began asking her, in front of everyone, to account for debts she had never known existed, attached to a name, her father's name, forged onto papers she had never signed. She felt the room the way one feels a sudden change in weather, a pressure against the skin before the storm itself arrives. Faces she recognized from the market, merchants who had haggled with her over pennies, women who had bought her preserves and complimented her mother's recipe, now looked at her with the particular hunger crowds reserved for someone else's ruin. A hunger that has very little to do with truth and a great deal to do with the relief of not being the one accused. Somewhere near the punch table, she caught sight of Harold Ashworth, composed and still, watching the scene he had built with the quiet satisfaction of a man observing a clock he had wound finally strike the hour. "Where is the note of the original loan?" she asked, when the magistrate paused for breath. "If my father borrowed money, there would be a record of the lending, not only of the debt. Who lent it? On what day? In whose presence?" The questions came out of her the same way her market sums did, quick, precise, impossible to argue with on their own logic. But no one in that room had brought paper enough to answer her, because no such paper had ever existed to begin with, and for one terrible moment it did not matter that she was right, because a crowd primed to believe the worst rarely waits for proof before it convicts. Her aunt had gone pale and silent beside her, wringing a handkerchief in both hands, offering nothing. Eleanor understood in that moment what it was to be entirely alone in a room full of people, and she straightened her spine anyway, because that, at least, no one could take from her. "I have never taken a coin that wasn't owed to me," Eleanor said, and her voice, though it trembled at the edges, did not break. She did not beg. She did not explain herself past what was true. Even here, even now, she would not lower herself to it. "If someone has put my father's name on a debt he never made, then someone has lied, and I would very much like to know who." It was, of course, the very worst moment for that question to be asked, because it was the moment before anyone had proof of an answer. And then Julian stepped forward. He had spent the better part of that week finishing what he had begun quietly, alone, by candlelight, cross-referencing every questionable entry in the estate's ledgers against the original tenant agreements kept in the county records, entries written not in his own hand, but unmistakably in Harold's. He had come to the assembly that evening already carrying what he needed, not yet certain he would need it so soon, not yet certain the woman standing accused before the whole county was the same woman whose figures he had watched, week after week, add up faster and more honestly than any merchants in the market. He crossed the room, and the crowd parted for him the way it always did, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned, from a girl in a market stall, that the truth rarely needs to be shouted to be heard. "The debt attached to Mr. Blythe's name does not exist," he said. "It was never lent, and therefore it can never rightly be collected. I have here the original tenant records, and I have here the entries made against them since. Entries made in a hand every person managing my estate's affairs would recognize as Mr. Harold Ashworth's own." He set the ledgers down where the magistrate could see them, and did not look away from Harold as he did it. "My cousin has, for some years, been directing tenant rents into accounts of his own, and inventing debts where none exist, in order to seize land he has no claim to. Miss Blythe's father was not a dishonest man. He was a man whose name was stolen after his death by someone who believed the dead could not defend themselves." The room, which had been ready to condemn Eleanor a moment before, turned as one toward Harold instead, the way a crowd's judgment always turns fastest toward whoever is left standing without an answer. Harold did not run. He did not shout. He simply stood very still, the color leaving his face, a man who had spent his whole life terrified of exactly this moment finally arriving at it. He was not dragged away in chains, nor ruined in any way that made a satisfying story for gossip. Stripped of his position and his claim to Marchmont, he was sent instead to manage a modest cousin's small holding in the north, a competent, unremarkable post, the kind of ordinary life he had spent every year of his existence trying to outrun. It was, in its quiet way, a fitting end. He was not destroyed. He was simply handed at last the plain and unglamorous life his fear had always been chasing him toward, and left to make of it what he could. Before he left Marchmont for good, Harold asked to speak with Julian alone, and Julian, against the advice of nearly everyone in his household, agreed. Harold did not ask for forgiveness, and did not offer excuses that pretended his choices had not been his own. He said only that he had spent his whole life watching his branch of the family stand just outside every door that mattered, and that somewhere along the way the fear of it had become larger than his sense of what was right, until he could no longer tell the two apart. Julian did not forgive him that day. He was not certain, standing there, that forgiveness was owed. But he found, to his own surprise, that he did not hate his cousin either, only pitied him in the plain, unsentimental way one pities a man who has spent years running from something that was never actually chasing him. The room, once Harold had gone, did not immediately return to its music and its dancing. It took a long moment, the particular silence of a crowd recalibrating its own judgment, ashamed in the way crowds rarely admit to being ashamed, of how quickly they had turned against a woman they had known for years the moment a rumor gave them permission to. Several of the very merchants who had haggled with Eleanor over pennies now would not meet her eye, and one or two came forward afterward with apologies so clumsy and so late that Eleanor accepted them only because refusing would have cost her more energy than she had left to spend that night. For Eleanor, the room's judgment turned back toward her almost as quickly as it had turned away, this time carrying something closer to shame at how easily they had believed the worst of her. She did not stay to enjoy their apologies. She found her aunt, thanked her quietly, and asked to be taken home, because her mother was ill and her brother was waiting, and because, whatever this man standing before the whole county turned out to be, she was still, first and always, the daughter who kept her family fed. Julian did not try to stop her that night. He understood, with the same quiet attentiveness that had first drawn him to her, that she needed the space to be angry. Angry at having been watched without knowing it. Angry at having liked a stranger who turned out to be the most powerful man in the county. Angry, perhaps most of all, at how frightened she had been standing alone in that room before he arrived, and how much she hated having needed rescuing at all. It was 2 weeks before he came to her again, and when he did not come to the great house, and he did not send a carriage, and he did not arrive dressed as a duke. He came to the market. He wore the same plain gray coat he had worn the very first day, and he found her at the same table, in the same cold, and he did not buy a jar of preserve this time. He simply stood where he had stood on that first morning, and waited his turn, the way she had once told him to, until the customer ahead of him had finished and gone. "I don't know how to thank you," Eleanor said, and hated faintly that it was the first thing she managed. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I only told the truth. You are the one who taught me it was worth telling." She studied him, the fine boots gone again beneath the plain coat. The careful stillness that she now understood was not caution, but exhaustion, a tiredness that came from years of being surrounded by people who told him only what he wished to hear. "You could have told me who you were," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't want to be a duke to you. I wanted, for 1 hour a week, to be only a man waiting his turn." There was a long quiet between them, the kind that market mornings rarely allowed, filled as they usually were with the noise of coin and haggling. Eleanor broke it first, because she always had, because waiting for someone else to speak first had never been in her nature. "What is it you want now, Your Grace?" "I want you to teach me," he said, "how you keep your figures so honest." It was not the request of a man asking for arithmetic lessons, and they both knew it. It was as close as a proud man, unused to asking anyone for anything, could come to telling a woman that he wanted her steadiness beside him for the rest of his life, that in a household full of people managing him carefully, he wanted, finally, someone who would simply tell him to wait his turn. Eleanor did not answer him with a speech. She was not a woman given to speeches. She looked at him for a long moment, the same level look she had given him the very first day, and said only, "Yes." And it was enough, because between the two of them, it had always been the plain, simple words that carried the most weight. "You should know," she added, once the word had settled between them, "that I will still correct you when your figures are wrong, Duke or not." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, the shadow of a smile on his face became the whole of it, unguarded, the way a man smiles when he has finally stopped bracing for the next disappointment. "It is, I think, the only honest thing anyone has offered me in years." "Then we shall get along," she said. "Very well indeed." Word of the match spread through the county faster than any rumor Harold had ever set loose, though this one, at least, carried nothing but goodwill behind it. The merchants who had once haggled with Eleanor over pennies now spoke of her with a strange, proprietary pride, as though the county itself had produced her, and in some sense it had. She had never once left it, never once needed to become someone else to be worthy of what came to her. She remained through it all the same woman who could tally a column of figures faster than any steward in the district, and she made very sure, in the months that followed, that no one at Marchmont ever forgot it. The wedding, when it came that spring, was smaller than the county expected of a duke, though grander than anything Eleanor's family had ever known. Her mother, whose health had begun, slowly, to mend once the fear of debt and ruin had finally lifted from the household, was well enough to sit through the whole ceremony, and cried through most of it in the quiet, unashamed way of a woman who has spent years being strong and is finally permitted for one afternoon not to be. Thomas, no longer a boy asked to leave his lessons for want of money, stood at his sister's side in a coat that fit him properly for the first time in years, beaming the particular pride of a young brother who has just watched his sister become, by every account but her own quiet estimation, the most powerful woman in the county. A year later at Marchmont, Eleanor had quietly taken over the estate's tenant accounts entirely, trusted with the very ledgers Harold had once corrupted, because everyone in the household, down to the newest housemaid, had come to understand that the young duchess could add a column of figures faster than any steward the estate had ever employed, and would never, not once, let a tenant be shorted a coin that was rightfully theirs. The market square where she had once sold jam in the freezing cold was, by then, fully hers by lawful right, and she had given a portion of it back to the town for a proper covered market, so that no girl selling preserves there ever again had to stand 3 mornings a week with chapped hands in the open wind. Her mother had come to live at Marchmont too, in a warm room with a window that caught the morning sun, and the cough that had once frightened Eleanor through every winter night had softened, over the year, into something closer to ordinary. She had taken up humming again, the way she once had in their old kitchen, and the sound of it drifting down the halls of so grand a house struck Julian the first time he heard it as one of the finest sounds he had ever let himself notice. Thomas had been given proper tutors, and true to his restless nature, had already declared 3 separate ambitions in the space of a year: soldier, shipbuilder, and most recently steward of his own small piece of land, and Eleanor let him declare each one without correcting him, because she remembered too well what it was to be told as a child that wanting things was a luxury not meant for people like them. Julian, for his part, had become a different sort of duke than the county had expected of him. Still quiet, still careful, but no longer cold in the way he had been before. No longer a man who walked past his father's portrait with his step deliberately quickened. He had taken, in fact, to pausing there most mornings, just briefly, and telling the old painted face some small thing about the day ahead. The way a man speaks to someone he has finally, belatedly, forgiven, himself as much as his father. And on the highest shelf of the kitchen at Marchmont, in the same simple clay jar it had always lived in, sat the damson preserves. No longer dusty, no longer waiting, because it had at last been opened on a soft afternoon in early autumn, the day their daughter was born. The whole household gathered in the kitchen that evening, servants and family together with no distinction of rank at all, and passed the jar from hand to hand, eating the preserves straight from spoons because Eleanor had insisted there was no need for finer dishes, that some things were worth celebrating exactly as they were, plainly, honestly, without ceremony. The same way, all those months before, she had once told a stranger in a gray coat to simply wait his turn. Their daughter was named Margaret, after Eleanor's mother, and she was born on a morning bright and cold in the particular way of early autumn mornings, The kind of cold that had once meant chapped hands and short rations, and now meant nothing more than a good excuse for a fire and warm cider. Eleanor's mother, holding her granddaughter for the first time, wept the easy, grateful tears of a woman who had once feared she would not live to see such a morning at all, and said only that the child had her father's steady eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, which made the whole kitchen laugh in a way that would have seemed impossible in that same family only 2 winters before. Eleanor held her that first evening by the kitchen hearth rather than in the grand nursery upstairs, because she wanted the child's first hours in the world to be spent somewhere that smelled of preserves and wood smoke, rather than polish and formality. And Julian, watching the 2 of them there in the firelight, understood that this ordinary, unglamorous warmth was the exact thing his cold house had been missing for 3 long years, and that he had found his way back to it not through any grand gesture of his own, but by once, in a plain gray coat, being told plainly to wait his turn. And on the highest shelf of the kitchen at Marchmont, in the same simple clay jar it had always lived in, sat the damson preserves, no longer dusty, no longer waiting, because it had at last been opened on a soft afternoon in early autumn, the day their daughter was born. The whole household gathered in the kitchen that evening, servants and family together with no distinction of rank at all, and passed the jar from hand to hand, eating the preserves straight from spoons because Eleanor had insisted there was no need for finer dishes, that some things were worth celebrating exactly as they were, plainly, honestly, without ceremony, the same way, all those months before, she had once told a stranger in a gray coat to simply wait his turn. Julian, watching his wife laugh with a spoon of damson jam in her hand, surrounded by a household that had not held a real laugh in years before her, understood at last that the wound his father's death had left in him had not healed because he had punished himself into some private redemption, but because he had let himself, finally, be plainly and honestly loved by someone who never once asked him to be anything other than a man waiting his turn. Outside, the last of the season's light settled gold over the fields that had once, however briefly, nearly slipped from a poor family's hands into a frightened man's grasp, and inside, the jar on the highest shelf sat empty at last, not with the old dust of waiting, but with the quiet, ordinary emptiness of a celebration that had finally, rightfully come. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.